Do you stick or twist? Because 2025 is stacking up to be a season like no other. New concepts for some, while others hold on to what they already know. But with new regulations on the horizon, who can deal with the change? It's time to see who's played their cards right down under, and who'll get lost in the shuffle. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Tech Talk for the 2025 Formula One season proper. Pre-season testing is done and dusted and the teams have headed down under to Australia, to Melbourne's Albert Park for the Australian Grand Prix. And some things are very much the same, as you already heard, but some things are a little bit different. That's right, a new season always means new rule changes. Except this season, that's not entirely true. There is a single significant new rule change. That's right, due to a driver cooling system, the car weights have increased by a whopping, well, it's about 2 kilos actually, just so the drivers can have this cooling system, which we're going to detail a little bit later in the season. However, that is not all. 2 kilos, it doesn't sound like very much, bolted to the driver's seat or bolted to the driver themselves. But when you locate that in the car, it could have a different effect as the season goes on your vehicle dynamics. But let's be honest, it's not the biggest change of the year. No, indeed, the biggest change of the year is the 2026 regulations. So with just a small rule change there, well, there's a few other detailed rule changes as well, but for a fairly minor rule change like that, it's not a big surprise that some of this year's cars look a little bit like last year's cars with a new paint job. And in the case of Williams and Alpine, they're actually retaining the same monocoques as they did last year. And a few people speculated that Red Bull Racing were doing the same thing. Well, it doesn't look like they are. And actually, even though the Red Bull does look really similar to last year's car, it is quite different. In fact, the team has been developing the car consistently through pre-season testing and right up to this weekend in Melbourne, and there are some interesting changes to the car. And one of the reasons that there are some changes to the car is that at the end of pre-season testing, I think it's fair to say that Max Verstappen wasn't particularly happy with the way the car was handling. And it was all down to a combination of parts that they introduced on the third day of the pre-season test. Down on the edge of the floor, a new floor was introduced to the car, and it kind of lost a bit of stability in that third day of the test. Some people are putting it down to the floor, but coming into Melbourne, Red Bull is still using that new specification floor. They're also using that new specification short nose that we talked about in pre-season testing. But one actual change that has been introduced for Melbourne, you can see here on the rear bodywork. They've opened up the rear cooling louvers on the engine cover quite significantly on the car, and that's a bit of a change. In fact, that whole cooling louver section was only added on the third day of the pre-season test as part of that upgrade package they introduced in Bahrain. And I think the layout of it is just quite interesting. It's worth taking a quick look at, because when you see the shape of the cooling outlet here, you can see a very distinctive downward section. And I wonder, are they trying to get a bit of downwash? Are they trying to channel the airflow down the side of the bodywork and on into that all-critical area on the inner face of the rear wheel? Not quite a blown diffuser, but it's kind of reminiscent of that shape, isn't it? You can see that a lot more clearly when you look at this angle of the outlet on the side of the car. You can see that very clear downward shape, and then you can see how it interacts with the shape of the rear of the side pod and the upper section that bulges out here, and you can see where that airflow is sort of going. It's sort of heading down in this direction. Now, you can't really see air, and well, unless your name's Adrian Newey, he's not with Red Bull anymore, but you can't really see air without a wind tunnel, so we can't be precise until they cover this thing in FlowViz, and then we'll get a bit more of an understanding of what that airflow is doing coming out of this revised cooling exit. But I think that's quite an interesting sign that Red Bull are playing around with their cooling layout. And underneath the bodywork, you can see that Red Bull have changed the cooling layout quite a bit since last season. And Red Bull's layouts are quite a topic for me, because I feel that they're not fully at home with that car still. In free practice 1 in Melbourne, Max Verstappen and Liam Lawson, neither of them looked fully happy with the cars as they were, and they were still changing the setup ever so slightly, and you saw both drivers fighting the car a little bit around the circuit in different ways as well. So a bit more to come from Red Bull Racing. But speaking of Red Bull Racing branded cars, not that one, another team that has changed quite a lot this season, not just their car design, but also, well, the team name, the team livery, and one of its drivers, Racing Bulls, previously known as AlphaTauri, previously known as Toro Rosso, and if you're old as me, previously known as Minardi. Well, Racing Bulls is Red Bull's other team, and it is the team previously known as AlphaTauri. Now, this car has drawn quite a lot of admiring glances from up and down the pit lane, and it is a little bit different to last year's car, and quite similar in other ways to last year's Red Bull. And I think to explain a little bit more about what's changed and what's still the same, it's worth having a word with one of the key people behind it, Permane, who's down in the pit lane talking to Lawrence Barretto.
It's quite different. The only thing that we've carried across from last year's car is the gearbox and rear suspension. So everything else is new. It's a new chassis. It's a completely new front wing. One of the things that we didn't really change through last year was the front wing, although we tried a lot to develop a new one in the wind tunnel. We've done that now. The whole thing is new. The floor is new. The front suspension is new. So it's the all underbody, radiator layout, all that side of things is all new. So it's essentially a completely new car minus the rear end.
Got you. And when we're talking about new bits on the car, I think often people think you're the sister team of Red Bull. They just give you a load of parts, but you've got a full team, obviously back at base, that are working hard independently on this
absolutely, car. Absolutely. We take what we can within the regulations, but all the aerodynamic side of it, 100% of the aerodynamic side of it is developed in house and made in house as well. So it's it's our car.
Now I know there's reasonable stability within the regs, so that maybe the chance to do something really cool with the car is a bit more tricky. But have you got any kind of really pieces you're particularly proud of, the team are particularly proud of, or particularly cool on there?
I think the bit that caught my eye when I first saw the car is the floor and the floor edge. I think you can see there it's pretty. It's like a work of art, and I hope that brings us some performance.
How different is what we're going to see this weekend to what we saw in Bahrain?
This is essentially the same car as we saw in Bahrain. We've got some front wing parts to test. But we also had those in Bahrain and we were playing with them there. But this is essentially the Bahrain car, yes.
And from a development perspective going forward, I know it's the same for everyone, but you've got this balance between 25 and 26. Are we going to see maybe a little bit more development earlier in the year to turn the taps on the other way for next year?
I'm very sure all teams will be doing that. Everyone will have a plan. I suspect after these first couple of races, those plans may change depending on where you are. If you expect to be 8th and you find yourself up 3rd, you're gonna change that plan. So everyone will have a development plan. Of course, there's a big incentive to get onto 2026 as quick as possible because of the rate of development is so much higher than the rate on this car.
So just finally, what is the mood kind of in the team at the minute? Because testing, I know, is always difficult to read, and I'm not expecting you to give me a prediction, but do you feel like you're in the mix to go out and fight there this weekend?
Absolutely, we do. You're right. It's incredibly difficult to predict. Yeah. And to say you know your own performance is, you really don't, because you don't really care about your own performance. All you care about is your relative performance. So you need to know everyone else's performance as well. So we know what we did, we know what fuel loads we had, we know what engine modes we had. We don't know what everyone else has. We'll know a bit more this weekend. We'll know another load more after the next weekend. So we'll see. The mood is good though. The mood is good.
Now, I'm still fascinated by this Racing Bulls car, and they've turned up in Melbourne with quite an interesting setup on the car in terms of the bodywork package fitted. And you can see that when you look at the rear bodywork from behind. Now, this may just look like another Formula One car to you when you look from behind the rear wing, but it's more about what you don't see in this picture. And I'm really struggling to see any cooling outlets on that rear bodywork. Now, the cooling exit at the rear of the car is very, very small. You can see that as the car drives out of the final corner really clearly as it's going around the track. But when you look on the upper section of the bodywork, you'd expect to see some cooling louvres either on this section of the bodywork or somewhere around here on the centre of the engine cover. But they're just not there. Now, this isn't down to the Honda power unit needing a bit less cooling than maybe some of the others, because when you take a look at the Red Bull, we've already taken a look at it, at the same angle, you can see these big cooling louvres opening on the rear bodywork. Red Bull also has some cooling slots just on the central spine. None of that present on the Racing Bull. And then that story gets a bit more interesting when you take a look at the rear wing. It looks quite skinny. It might be the angle of this image, but I don't know. It looks like quite a low downforce rear wing for the Melbourne circuit. And it just looks to me that maybe Racing Bulls have gone for a slightly different approach to the circuit. compared to other teams. They've gone for maybe a lower drag setup. We're waiting to see some of the data to see how that plays out, and we'll update you in China not only what the setup is, but also whether it really worked. But it's quite a different approach, as I say, from Racing Bulls. Now, staying on the subject of rear wings, you may notice in this shot quite a lot more optical contact across the rear wing. Those are these little target logos all over that rear wing. Lots more than we saw last season. Now, this is because one of the other changes for 2025. At the end of 2024, there was a bit of speculation about how some teams were using their rear wings in terms of, were they flexing too much, were they deforming in particular ways to reduce drag at high speed? And it was originally sort of reported that the FIA weren't going to take any additional action on rear wings. However, coming into this season, shortly before pre-season testing, it became clear that the FIA were going to take a slightly stronger look at what teams are doing with their rear wings, hence additional optical contact. The FIA are going to be looking with some different cameras at how the rear wings are deforming at high speed, and just trying to understand exactly what teams are doing with their wings. And I have heard some rumours in the paddock that there are some eyes scooting about on different people's rear wings, but usually that's just paddock chatter, because how long have we been talking about flexible wings in Formula One? Since the first wings were fitted to Formula One cars in 1968. Have a look at Tech Talk Retro for a little bit more about that. You can find that elsewhere. Now, rear wings are still a topic, because when you start talking about the shape of the rear wing here for the Racing Bull, nearly called it an AlphaTauri, you can see that they fitted a gurney along the trailing edge of the wing, suggesting, it's a bit of dirty downforce, but it does work. A lot of teams are doing that approach. Are they running a bit of a lower wing angle than some of the other teams? Well, let's have a comparison. There's the Racing Bull. Let's compare to their sister team, Red Bull Racing, and have a look. You can see what I'm talking about here. It's quite a bigger dished lower section. The main plane on the Red Bull looks a bit bigger here, very similar camera angle. And then the upper section, again, a gurney fitted to the central section of the flap, looks a bigger wing to me. When you look at that, compare it to this, I don't think it's an optical illusion, do you? It looks like Racing Bulls have got a simpler, lower drag rear wing on the car. And if you look on the outer edge past the roll tip, look how flat that is. And then look at the tip of the flap. It looks to be one big single part, and I'm not sure it necessarily fully separates here. I think it probably has to by regulation, because you've got the DRS flap there, but it does look like that flap there is just very much set, very flat. The wingtips are of particular interest compared to Red Bull. Now look how much more complex the Red Bull wingtips are. Very different in their shape, sharper leading edge, very sculpted outer element. Red Bull playing around there with the rear wing. That story, though, continues down the pit lane. Ferrari, they've introduced a new rear wing for the Australian Grand Prix. Quite a different main plane section. You can see it dipping down in the centre around the DRS pylon. And again, like Red Bull, they've got this extension. But unlike Red Bull, Ferrari's upper flap here, or the wing extension, does join the main plane fully. Not quite as extreme as Red Bull's, but pretty similar in overall concept. And as we work our way through the rear wings on the grid down to Mercedes, you can start to see some different variations on this theme. Now Mercedes's extension, it's a very different shape to Red Bull and also to Ferrari. Much bigger extension, picking up in a different location on the wing with a larger cutout on the rear section there. Mercedes trying a slightly different direction. No big dip here, but again, much steeper wing than we saw on the Racing Bulls car, perhaps a much steeper wing than we've seen on any of the other cars actually. That could work with the multiple DRS zones that are on track around Melbourne. Could help the team in corners, bit more cornering force perhaps, compared to some of the other teams with high top speeds, but they get their top speeds in DRS. Maybe Mercedes not expecting to be at the front of the field, but fighting in the pack. We'll have to wait and see about that. Aston Martin, pretty similar story down there. And down at Alpine, well, perhaps a different sort of wing flexibility going on there, or maybe it just got a little bit cold, not sure about that. Talking about some of the wings, Williams, they shocked everybody in free practice 1, didn't they? Because that car was much quicker than anybody expected with Carlos Sainz at the wheel. Alex Albon wasn't particularly a slouch either. However, the Williams is an old car. Is it a case of the last of the old beats the first of the new? We'll have to wait and see how this car develops through. Some lovely little details on this car, which we highlighted before. Down here, this extra little winglet on the rear wing pylon, and then the trailing edge of the shark fin at the back of the bodywork. Really nice little details. Wonder if other teams will start to copy that. And then take a look at Sauber. Well, yeah, not many people are going to be looking at the back of the Sauber, looking how the form is at the moment, because it'll only be when their blue flags come out and they get lapped, unless they find some pace with this car, because I think it is quite an interesting design, and maybe we need to learn a little bit more about that. And speaking of learning a little bit more about the cars, there are quite a lot of details on the cars up and down the field. Mercedes, for example, I've noticed have completely revised their exhaust layout this year. They've had the same exhaust layout for the last few seasons, but they've changed it this year. Have they slightly relocated the turbocharger? Has the change to the rear suspension that introduced a little while ago, has that changed their routing of some of the parts? Or has the change to the cooling system meant that they need to change the positions of the exhaust? There are still so many questions that remain unanswered in Formula 1 2025, but this is just race one and there's so much more to learn, and we're going to be learning it right here on Tech Talk.